Hi. Hi, Kate. I can see you there. Hi,
It's just a
Austin.
Zoom thing.
Hi, Zara. We're just waiting for people to join. Thanks for joining us today. If you would kindly make sure you're on mute, that would be helpful. And so I think we'll start and we will allow other people to join, but I'll just take care of housekeeping whilst we're doing that. So thank you for joining us today. This webinar is being held as part of Net Zero Week 2026, which is the UK's National Awareness Week, being sponsored by Balfour Beatty. So thank you to Balfour Beatty. And today we're going to be talking about unlocking collective intelligence in net zero. I'm also obliged to tell you that the session is being recorded and will be shared with the Net Zero Week database. Fabulous. Okay, so I'm Leanne Case. Thank you for joining us today. I'm the founder of Vzir. And for those of you who don't know me already, Vzir works with organizations to turn their biggest environmental and social challenges into opportunities for growth. So right now at Vzir, we're working with companies who are under real pressure to deliver net zero, and it's in a context that's more complex and certain than ever, in my opinion. Leaders are being asked to deliver certainty in a context that is fundamentally uncertain. So our focus today is on how organizations can use what they already have, so the perspectives, experiences, and everything they have to harness or unlock the collective intelligence in their organization. So, just to share with you what we are going to talk about today, if we're just on the agenda slide, we're going to talk about the concept. So, what do I mean when I talk about collective intelligence, and why are we talking about that now? We're going to ask our experts to share some transformation stories. I'm joined by some wonderful speakers today, and I'll say more about that shortly. We're going to look at strategy and design. So, how do you build strategy and transformation that's wide ranging? And then we're going to talk about the practical realities. We all know that implementing change can be challenging, and hopefully, we're going to give you some practical tips that you can take with you and implement on Monday morning. So, without further ado, if we go to the next slide, Kelly, what do we mean when we talk about collective intelligence? So, collective intelligence, from our perspective at Vizier, is using every single thing at your disposal to create competitive advantage. So, every perspective, experience, and all the expertise in your organization and wider system to come up with better solutions and better strategies. And we think this is especially important in the current context, which is a new frontier, that companies are flexible and adaptive, and above all, relevant to the current context. So, in this context, net zero is a huge pressure, a huge objective, adding much complexity to the system that leaders are being asked to deliver against in an uncertain context. And we're working with leaders to help them tap into all that intelligence in the system to adapt to this context. So, when I was talking to one of our speakers, Abby, yesterday, I was asking her from her perspective of organizational change and strategy, what it meant to her, the phrase collective intelligence. And Abby was very direct with me, which I always appreciate. And she said that it sounded like an ideal that was totally unrealistic in large organizations. And I don't think Abby will mind me sharing this with you because she has a lot of experience in working in large, complex, technical organizations. And so for me, that's a very valid comment. So, and it's a tension that I want us to talk about here today. For us, harnessing collective intelligence is not an ideal, it is an aspiration, but it's the work that you do in getting there that improves commercial outcomes. So I think the tension that Abby very directly named is on the one hand, you have an ideal of, and these were Abby's words, avoiding groupthink and really working on complex technical organizations to unlock complex and creative decision making. And on the other hand, you have the realism of the organization, which is about rigid structures, hierarchical cultures, and short term pressures. And in highly technical organizations, there needs to be that kind of process and check on what's being done. So, how do you juggle those two quite opposite things to really unlock collective intelligence in the system and come up with more intelligent solutions? So, Vzir sits right at the heart of that tension. And over the last 25 years, I have built an international career on people telling me that the objectives they've been set are unrealistic, and working with them and seeing time and time again that teams can achieve outcomes that they originally thought were impossible by working differently and by harnessing more of the collective intelligence in the system. So why does it matter now? Well, I'm sure that you'll all agree that in the context of net zero commitments and regulatory pressure, not to mention economic uncertainty, energy security, dare I mention today, if you've watched the news, and polarization against globalization, great technological advances, depending on how you see AI, for example. But I think this is a time of unprecedented change. And regardless of where your politics sit, you can see that within organizations, there's a huge demand for change on one side, and then there's the rigid structures that have allowed technical organizations to deliver what they've delivered to date. So, in a world where we're operating, which is shaped by globalization and increasingly polarization, even if countries try to pull back, and I have promised, and Abby also promised that we're not going to talk about Brexit today, but even when countries do try to pull back, the reality of those interconnected systems don't go away. So your teams, your supply chains, and your stakeholders are more diverse and more interdependent than ever. There's a tension right there. But many leadership models, in my opinion, are based on assumptions from 50 or even 100 years ago. So the gap between today's reality and yesterday's leadership models is where a lot of opportunity and a lot of risk now sits. And so I was going to share an example with you, but I think rather than me share an example, now would be a great time to introduce our two amazing speakers. And so we are joined by Paula Carter, an expert in transformation and change. Paula has spent her career in the thick of major change and transformation at BT, working for the Department for Education and across multiple complex organizations. Paula is also passionate about net zero, is involved in some really fascinating projects at the moment, and she has a brilliant eye for where collective intelligence is used well and where it's not being utilized. And so she's going to shortly share some stories with us about where transformation has worked and where it hasn't. But just before I hand over to Paula, I'm also going to introduce Abby. Abby was head of corporate UK and decarbonisation strategy at National Grid, quite the mouthful, where she was responsible for leading strategy and change across the networks. And Abby brings a wonderfully honest view of the tension between the ideal of unlocking collective intelligence and the reality of working in large scale technical organizations. And we're really grateful to have them both with us today to share their experience and expertise. So, Paula, if you'd like to share with us your stories of where transformation or strategic change has worked and what made the difference to a successful outcome and an unsuccessful one.
Absolutely. And thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this today and for all of you attending and listening. Um, it does excite me, change management and transformational programs, because it's where you can undertake growth. And I think what I've always thought is that transformation programs underlying the mechanics of adoption, transformation are all exactly the same, regardless to what it is that you're wanting to deliver. And it's important to establish who's in the room, who has a voice, and whether people get to shape the answer or just get handed one. And interestingly, Anne, when you mentioned Brexit, I was heavily involved in Brexit when I was in the Department for Education. Now, trying to lead teams into the unknown was very, very difficult, very challenging at the time, but I think we could all reflect back on that. And I think that it's worth dwelling on for a second that because good change management isn't a nice to have, and this is a crusade that I'm frequently on, it really and genuinely is valuable. And if it's done well, it avoids waste, fewer false starts, and less duplicated effort, and less time and resource spent on doing decisions that were never properly tested first. So that leads me nicely into an example of what I had. I took on a team. It's quite a significant sized team I inherited, but they were, until I started, it was classed as an underperforming team. And I had no idea. And they were leading operations in a really fundamental part and significant part of a department. There was no structure. There was no one in the organisation that expected anything from them. And ultimately, sadly, they'd been written off. So I arrived with a question, not a plan. And you'll note throughout this example, we is used quite a lot rather than I. And I think that is the operative word, is the we. So not I ran a deep dive, we ran a deep dive into skills, experience and gaps, and co-designed a completely new structure around what we found. And it was amazing when you get people in a room and start to encourage them to feel safe and to speak up. It was fantastic what I was actually able to unpick. And it actually surprised the people that were in the room as well. And throughout that, what it did, it created an environment, as I say, was safe, but it started to build a culture that where new things were introduced, such as automation to remove mundane activity, repetitive work, they became more receptive to it. So rather than having that initial kind of resistance over job security, they started to work with me, because what they started to do then is to help redesign how that team were going to work. We unfolded the team's environmental impact as well as part of the redesign. Travel patterns. There was a lot of travel just for the sake of it, lots of paper use, the printing, energy usage, and overall the footprint of the manual processes that were involved that were then being automated. So rather than just treating it as a sustainability as a separate initiative to land on them later, it was built into the one design of how the team was going to be restructured, and to avoid waste, both resource and in terms of materials.
Fascinating. Paula, I have one
Oh
question
yeah, yeah,
for you before you share the example of what hasn't worked. And
yeah, yeah, yeah.
in that context, I'm assuming they were possibly quite demoralized if they were
Oh yeah.
written off. How did you convince them to engage in the process in the first place?
Listening to them. Now I can't hide away from the fact the first day that we met, it was getting them into a room at the same time. Most of them they'd been working together for months that had never met each other. Now, I was in a very fortunate position because there was no expectations of the team. I could justify them all coming together. So utilizing that, but then hearing about their stories of what they'd done in the past, that started to excite them, because they suddenly thought, well, actually, do you know what? I did deliver. I was of value. And it was such a sad story to hear that at that moment in time that they were an underperforming, undervalued team. But bringing back past experiences and giving opportunities for them to, like we're doing now, is share stories. You tend to find passion comes from that,
Yeah,
particularly if there's a good outcome as well, or a positive outcome.
fascinating. I'd love to delve in more into that, but I'm aware you were also going to share a story on an example that hasn't worked. So why don't you share that with us?
Oh yeah. So there was another department that I was brought into, and interestingly, brought in by the leadership team to deliver a change framework. So as part of this area, 51% of the work was it was contracted out. So you can imagine the external parties that we were working with. There was lots of change coming in that was managed really well in silos, but not having the holistic view. And then when legislational changes were coming in at the last minute and expecting to be adopted within days,
Mm.
there was a lot of undue pressure and stress that was put on those teams. The teams were not the real challenge. So, whilst the leadership team were the ones that introduced me to come in, they were the ones that were really resistant to it because suddenly there needed to be some accountability and
Uh-huh.
ownership and following lead times. And the teams were fantastic because suddenly they were in an environment where we're being heard. And once that trust had been, won over, the ideas that were coming through were fantastic. But then pushing that to the leadership team and saying, look, if this is how you're wanting it to look, this is where you're part of this commitment has to come from yourselves. And that was the biggest challenge, I would say, in that organisation.
Fantastic. I hear you talking about listening as being really important and actually understanding where the issue lies. Because I think when we talk about collectiveness, it's about understanding the whole process of how things are delivered and not only who's responsible for it on paper. Thanks for sharing that, Paula. I'm going to ask Abby now to share from her background a story of change or strategy that's worked and one that hasn't. Abby.
Thanks very much, Leanne, and great to hear some of the descriptions that Paula has given, which certainly resonate. So, look, I've been in the energy sector coming up to 20 years. I've worked across renewables, energy retail, infrastructure system operations, and probably about 15 years doing strategy, everything from industry-wide strategy to corporate strategies to business go-to-market strategies, you name it. I'm going to start with where it didn't work. And there's quite a few examples of where it didn't work. And you learn probably more of when it doesn't work because you go back and you do a sort of a post-mortem. But that taught me how to do a pre-mortem to make sure that I could set up for success in the future. So one example that springs to mind when I was working for an entity a few years back was trying to pull together a corporate strategy for a business that was going through so much change. The executive team didn't really know what their future really looked like. They had a huge amount of pressure that was being put through as they were shifting ownership into a government model, and then really saying what sort of capability or ability did they have to actually steer that direction. And that pressure made it really difficult for them to articulate what was that going to look like. So when you then say to them, well, look, what's your corporate strategy going to look like? What are you going to be thinking about and doing in 10 years' time? It felt like it was an unfathomable question that they couldn't cope with. And timing of this was also really difficult because they were trying to sort of navigate a whole load of those operational nearer term pressures and also standing up a very large transformation program. So my key lesson there is that sometimes when you are doing things with a very senior audience, timing is the number one thing. And it comes back to almost the Goldilocks approach, right? You can't be too hot, too cold. And also you can't be too soon or too late. And if you're too late, then you're very limited on what options you can have. But if you're too soon for things, it just doesn't resonate. And so it then meant that myself and my team ended up doing lots of different pseudo corporate strategies and sort of like a light version, just to almost test it with them. And it then became a process of elimination of saying, does it look a little bit like this or this or this, as opposed to actually getting them themselves to articulate it. So lots of lessons that I learned there. One that actually worked really quite well in contrast, though, coming back to that timing theme, was when I was in another organization, a big six energy supplier at the time, that had actually failed with quite a few massive transformation, was hemorrhaging customers, and was staring down the barrel of potentially future fines because of the smart meter program. And when I'm sort of casting back sort of 8-10 years ago, smart metering was the stuff that everybody was really focused on because there was loads of stuff that needed to be done by 2020. Now the 2020 deadline came and went, and I think things elsewhere, shall we say, we're not talking about Brexit, sort of took more precedence. So then it was a case of they really desperately needed to have something that actually do something differently. They knew they had problems. They had pain points coming out of their arms, of every different thing, what wasn't going on as far as sort of the operational teams or the leadership buy-in. And I basically put forward a proposal saying, look, here's a different way of actually going about doing a sort of a lean style transformation program that isn't just about the actual operational piece. It isn't just about the end-to-end process or also the leadership direction that's needed. It's about wrapping all of those three things together. And that was actually given a huge supporting thumbs up by the exec member at the time, plus also his leadership team. But with that came the point of saying, look, this is commitment that you're needing. This needs to be your number one priority. You cannot be chasing down another 8 or 10 different priorities. You really need to be focusing time and dedication onto this. This will be taking up 40% of your space and your capacity to make sure this is actually executed upon. So there, the timing was already in place, because if there wasn't a proper burning platform, they could see that the platform, and I mean this figuratively, they could see that things were really becoming turbulent in a tangible amount of time that they really needed to do a proper transformation program. And I was lucky and fortunate enough to stick around in that program for about 9 months to run through all the diagnostics, sort of help them come up with a proper delivery and implementation plan. And they did actually start to make some real significant difference and some big upticks. Now, the business went out of business because it was acquired by another supplier, but that was not any of the failing from that particular business unit that was doing some really great transformative work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting about how you measure success. And I guess the energy industry is full of examples of transformation, which will essentially make themselves redundant, but it's about what you're aiming for and how you measure success. And so thank you for sharing those examples. I think we can all resonate. You dropped some big name there, some big names, Brexit and smart metering. Anybody that's been involved in those two, I think opportunities for transformation, shall we say, will have a lot of insight about what works and what doesn't work. And so I really want to give the audience opportunity for questions. If you have questions or you want to tell us why you were motivated to join us today, feel free to put your hand up or to put your question in the chat. And for the next question, I really want to ask you about what net zero is adding to this transformation or strategy space right now. So in this kind of volatile world, how are net zero imperatives either enabling or preventing change from where you're sitting?
Yeah, I think to add to that, Leanne, I think with leaders, it's got to be beyond just a tick in a box exercise. There's a lot of great ideas and suggestions that come from teams and your middle management. And I think leaders need to start to accept scrutiny and not just ask for it. And I think from a collective intelligence, it can soon dry up fast if leadership is happy to hear a challenge from others, but resistant to actually be challenged themselves. So I think that's quite a critical part as well.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. And anybody who knows me or has spoken to me for more than 10 minutes will most likely have heard me talk about how passionate I am about the opportunity for transformation that net zero is providing, but how frustrated I am at seeing that opportunity sometimes be missed in the form of performative accounting, let's say. But I don't think this is the place for me to expand on that right now. So Abby, I'm going to come to you and ask you the same question.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. So look, if I zoom all the way out, net zero is really a driver for us to try and have a sustainable future. Pure and simple, right? And we may quibble about, well, why would the UK bend over backwards to do this? Because it's a global weather system and we only make up 1% of carbon emissions. But we all know, as we're actually experiencing live right today, that hotter climates are going to make things much more difficult for everyone, and not just us, for every species on the planet. So that has been I suppose, a technical solution of saying if we get to net zero, then we will be able to curtail carbon emissions and also temperature rises globally. That's sort of the aspiration. And we set some arbitrary deadlines. We said by 2050. Now, then a key factor of that is the energy component, right? It's the easiest part and the first part to actually be able to decarbonize, and it can be a key enabler to other parts. So if you look at it from electricity and actually the electrification of networks and basically the things that we use and the stuff that we need to power, it's a way to actually run things in a sort of a low carbon, zero carbon approach, and also could be enabler to things like heat, to be able to switch sort of heating from, again, higher carbon emissions to lower carbon emissions, but also transport. And transport also is a very hefty enabler, or sorry, emitter of carbon emissions, at least domestically here in the UK and also globally. So you can see that that then becomes an enabler to others. Now, the real challenge comes from a breakdown of consensus, right? You know, we often in the energy sector talk about energy trilemma, which, if you think about it from a triangle, is a case of, well, which is the top of the triangle. But actually, sometimes it's not a case of there is a single point at the top. It's what's the 2 points which are at the top and which one is now at the bottom. And it is sort of the rebalancing that's constantly in flight. I'd say about 3-4 years ago, it was a case of sustainability was the major driver because things were relatively calm, or at least they were before the Russian illegal invasion of the Ukraine, which then kicked off some of our, you know, a lot of the stuff domestically here in the UK. So that's sort of, let's go back even further. Let's say sort of 4 or 5 years ago. And that felt like that was the key driver for us to sort of go after. But then affordability comes into play because, you know, the costs that we're actually looking at and factoring for are also a couple of things. So part of an energy transition, and the word transition in some ways implies a sort of a nice, orderly, smooth migration of things, which it isn't. It's messy, as far as that's concerned. But it's also, you know, it's underinvestment that's happened in infrastructure that's been lasting for over, you know, for decades, for sort of like 2-3 decades or so. So time is now catching up as we are needing to now invest in things which were underinvested, double the size of our electricity networks that we have, and then be the enabler for others to be able to electrify and sort of take out carbon from our sort of, you know, our carbon credits that we have here domestically in the UK. Now, what does that mean? It means that there's going to be some difficult choices. And the other one on that energy trilemma that's come into play recently has been around energy security, security of supply, energy sovereignty. You know, the fact that we are so well connected with what happens internationally in a global space at the moment, so that when there are challenges and difficulties in the Middle East, it actually directly impacts ourselves, which comes back to that affordability and also security of supply perspective. So it's then a case of, can net zero be achieved through, you know, just sustainability alone drives, or are there other things which will sort of help us bridge towards that? And the reality is we don't yet know. We don't yet know what the endpoint actually is exactly, and we don't yet know exactly how to get there. But for me, the collective intelligence piece here is by tapping into lots of the creative ideas from lots of people and actually cracking on and making progress, because we can often get, you know, too bogged down with trying to make a perfect decision when sometimes we just need to make progress and try not to make, you know, really difficult choices or the inappropriate choices that we will then regret in future years.
I absolutely.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, just to add to that, I totally agree with that, but I also think it's making the invisible visible. Because I think there's a lot that's been done. We don't have to, you know, none of us are in a position to boil the ocean, but there are fundamental things that we can do collectively that, you know, can actually make a difference. And I think what we have to make sure is that, you know, the fragmented and siloed activity that's going on, I think is We are duplicating efforts within businesses.
Agreed.
We are naturally creating waste, not often intentionally, but I think what we need to do is to be able to look at things holistically and map how things are working.
Yep.
But just, I think, appreciate what's within our grasp. Because if we're always looking for the end goal, we're never going to get there, but we can all ultimately collectively make a difference together.
Agreed. And so that comes
Abby,
back to
I'm just gonna intervene there because I wanted to say that I think on your point, Abby, you talked about prioritization. And I think this is about prioritization, but a question to you both. And Abby, you're obviously looking at it from inside energy, and Paula, you're looking at it from a wider industry perspective. I wanted to ask you, um, how much is in the power of businesses when net zero is a primarily political, policy-driven initiative? So, how much is in the power of businesses to prioritize in this context and to decide where to put their efforts in that context?
Mm. Do you want me to take that one? Yeah, I was going to say from an industry perspective, what you're dealing with as well as organisations, that everything's urgent, everything's a priority, and you quite easy, and I see it so often, is there's the fatigue, change fatigue, because it's not just the net zero, it's everything else that they're having to drive. That we've got AI that suddenly, that's been around for 70 years, is suddenly a priority. That every industry has to have AI, regardless to what it looks like and what it's going to do, and automation. We can have these nice shiny new toys and the new technologies, but ultimately, are we just shifting an uplift of legacy into it? I think really is understand your organisation, what they're driving at the moment, and going back to what Abby was saying, having a strategy is so important, having an objective, and then breaking it down systematically so that it becomes more achievable for teams to work together to deliver the overall focus and purpose.
Thank you, Paula. Abby.
so how much is in the power of businesses to prioritize net zero in the overall context? Well, I think it comes back to the purpose of the business. And a lot of the ways to actually enact change is not done just purely in a business, right? It is done politically. It will be through carrots and sticks. People will be given incentives to do things, or they'll be given penalties for not doing things. And part of the net zero agenda here is it's not just that, it starts very well with the energy sector, but it's then supposed to be that every individual, every part of the economy is actually decarbonizing and is, moving to as low carbon sources of doing that as possible. That's really hard to do if you are in an area that hasn't got the infrastructure in place. So if you are looking at sustainable aviation fuels, for example, and those aren't readily available and they're not cost competitive and no one else is doing it, that makes it difficult. If also your bottom line is about profitability that you need to be enacting, and what's competition up to. So it isn't easy. It really isn't easy. And I think it's also then, how does this fit into that sustainability agenda? Because I think everybody does understand that there's a moral objective to this, because of a selfish objective that we all need to be in a society where things are actually better for us in the future rather than worse. But things aren't in our control. So I think one of the points that Paula was talking about, and I completely resonate with that holistic piece, is what's the whole system thinking, and where does they get to a tipping point? So where do you avoid just being an early adopter, which could be, at the very front of a peloton, if I was to use that analogy, right? Leading the pack, but then at some point others will overtake, or also will fall off by the wayside because you've burnt out really quickly, you're exhausted, and there's no one else to keep fueling you and keeping you up, as being part of that pack. And that's the real challenge at the moment. And it does feel as though in some ways, by having set that target that felt realistic of saying, well, we'll do a little bit by 2030, maybe 2035, but we'll worry about things like 20, 25 years hence. That felt like it's just too far in the future for people who are really worried on sort of the short term. I do wonder, coming back to that tipping point, though, of how much we will sort of shift on the dial when we realize that the forecasts and future weather pattern temperatures that we were expecting as sort of a worst case scenario in sort of 30, 40 years hence is actually starting to come through right now. So at what point do we look at, climate adaptation and shift that as a key priority again, and sort of also shift gear into climate mitigation rather than just being quite complacent about it. So I think it's really challenging, and it also will be up to each individual business to be able to figure out how it can factor that. But I would say what has shifted and changed over the last 10 years is that sustainability isn't just a label. It is something that people do actually care about. They put reporting out, it should be part of annual reports and various different details. But if you're looking at sort of different types of emissions to be able to reduce, it's concentrating on the things that you can have your own control over. And I think that's the real focus, concentrating what you can actually make a difference of, rather than just being fully reliant on, third parties to actually have to do. That becomes a bit more complicated and messy.
Well, I think that's fascinating, and I'm actually going to disagree with you on a point that I feel really strongly about, and that is talking about morality in terms of sustainability. I think one of the pressures that businesses have had to contend with is trends since the influence of social media. So businesses and reputations have come under increasing pressure in a new way that I have seen drive businesses to try to stay on top of trends. And I said I wasn't going to mention diversity, but I do feel very strongly that if we're actually talking about sustainability, we're talking about environmental, social, and economic impact.
Yeah.
Rather than just carbon emissions. So if you were to talk about sustainability in the true strategic sense of the word, I experience that talking about moral obligations actually confuses it for businesses. And in fact, if you remove the idea of moral obligation, but you talk about the reality and the opportunity, it's much easier to look beyond the trends and align with where that particular business, can have most impact in driving sustainability, because that's aligned with their own business model and value. So I am going to disagree there, but again, I will rein myself in because I really get very much on my high horse about that. So I think in terms of prioritization, trends, and those tensions, I wanted to come back to you, Paula, and ask, do you see it the same? So businesses that are not on the cutting edge. So Abby, you're working in an energy, and obviously the electrification of the grid is at the forefront of decarbonisation and policy. And so it's understandable that for businesses working there, it's very much on their minds, and they're very much aware of the right things to say and do. And yet I would even say there's a tension there. Again, I often talk about short-term measures, so electrification, use of minerals, precious minerals, child labor. I mean, there's just so much complexity in this space that I don't think we're talking about enough. But I wonder, for companies who are not at the kind of coal edge of that transition, how they see at the moment sustainability versus net zero, and how passionate they still feel about it, or empowered they feel to be in that space, Paula.
I think that's a brilliant summary that you've put together there, because that just, what I'm going to do is just echo the confusion that's out there in industry and businesses. There's a lot of confusion. I think there's lack of clarity to know what they can control and what they can't control, and also around measures of, measures of success. How do they know that they're achieving it, and how they're contributing to it as well? I don't think there's enough about that. And when you were saying about social media and trends, it goes back to like the new shiny toy or technology, or it's trying to keep up with like a fashion, and businesses are focused on that, and trying to focus on what they believe is a solution, rather than they're skipping straight to that, rather than understanding how are we actually in reality going to get there, and also understand why. So there's a big factor that I go with every organisation, business I work in, is, challenge the what and the why with leadership, but the how and the when comes with the people and the teams together. But you can't get to the how until you're really clear with the why and the what. And a lot of leaders, to be fair to them, are struggling because, like I say, there is a lack of clarity and understanding, because you hear one story of an approach one week, the next, and I think the problem you run the risk with social media is open to opinion as well, and that floods it and confuses it. And I think what my advice to industry and businesses is assess how your business runs, very much like Abby said, is understand what's within your control, and scale up or scale down depending on the size of the organisation. But some of the businesses aren't at the level that some organisations are, that can ultimately be the front runners for supporting net zero. And then they get the accreditation for it. I think it needs to be broken down into manageable levels that are easily communicated and then measured for businesses to then adopt. And I think that's where we've got a gap.
Fantastic. Really, really interesting. I love the what and why and the how and when with the people. And that really brings it back to the idea of collective intelligence. For me, um, one of the things that I've witnessed is the siloing of sustainability or carbon accounting. And again, one of my frustrations that I used to talk about a lot earlier in the sustainability days were the sustainability development goals. I saw, for example, a lot of companies trying to match their activities to that. And one company I think of in particular that was operating out of a really deprived area in the UK, but were focusing all their activities on international development, like activities, schools in Africa, for example. And I found, whilst I could understand that might be inspiring for the team in some way, I felt there was also a big disconnection between what sustainability means for me if you were going to take a wider view. And look at the context that you're actually in. So I see now with a lot of companies a sustainability team over here, and a lot of the work I'm doing is bringing that back into the business, and unleashing a lot of intelligence across the business to refine those plans and help them focus, as you've kind of said. So I just want to ask you, coming back to the idea of collective intelligence in this debate, where do you see the opportunity? And I guess the barriers, I guess there are a lot of fears in organizations if you start talking about unlocking intelligence and engaging more people in discussions or decision-making processes. But where do you see that this would be beneficial, and where do you see that it would meet a lot of resistance or potentially cause problems?
So just to be clear, Leanne, are you talking about from that collective intelligence perspective where the opportunities and barriers are related to net zero?
Yeah, so in organizations that you've worked within, where do you feel that harnessing collective intelligence would add to the decision-making process, and where do you think it might actually cause problems, or where there would be fears within the organization about doing that?
So I think from my experience, it really comes down to, similar to what Paula said, the size of an organization. And therefore, if you are looking at large corporates of tens of thousands of individuals, the decision making is typically, it does go upwards, right? It goes to the very top of the pyramid. And ultimately, what's going to be decided by a CEO or a president of a particular unit versus what can be empowered and delegated at different levels. Operational decisions need to be delegated because they need to make sure that things are continuing to run and function. But if they are big strategic decisions, that decision making obviously sort of sits at the top. So that's where I think there is it's a tension with regards to that collective intelligence. Sometimes it will be a case of even hiring it in externally, asking a bunch of consultants that can come in with a badge and a label and basically say, look, we've put our name and our stamp behind it, as almost a form of risk mitigation for any decision that, could be blamed upon that particular organization in the future. Because, sometimes if you are looking at putting investments of millions or billions behind something, you need to know what actually happened and how was that decision actually achieved. So if you have really large organizations, I think the amount of thinking that gets done sometimes gets elevated to the top, and the doing then sort of gets pushed further down. And I think the nervousness there is coming back to, as Paula said, sometimes they be clear about the why, but even the what itself can shift and change. And it's then saying, well, what does the objective need to be at such a high level that you can break it down into, but what does that mean in sort of a near-term perspective, and how are we going to execute on that, and how are we actually going to really deliver that? And I think the bit that where it's different, right, is if you have smaller, more dynamic organizations, somebody may have a job title, but they'll be wearing 12 different hats, right? They'll be doing lots of different things, and they really want to be doing that collaborative thinking. And they'll actually say to people, look, what am I missing? What am I actually, not seeing here? And sometimes that's really easy to do in a smaller organization, because you feel like you're actually all rowing in the same direction, and you are carrying a lot of weight on that sort of pushing things forward. If you are part of a very large tanker, to use that sort of analogy, if you do or don't contribute to things, sometimes you may feel as though your actual voice isn't being heard. So I think that comes back to then, well, how do you create those spaces for people to be involved in coming up with ideas and being able to ask questions that might come across initially as being, I know people label that as dumb questions, or, you can often see people forget, they ask for permission first of all, say, excuse me, this might be a really silly question. But
Yes.
sometimes being able to ask those really obvious questions, and it's not necessarily putting any indication as to whether it is dumb or not behind it, but saying really obvious questions actually helps unlock something that may have been overlooked for quite a while beforehand. And that's really important.
It is, Abby. That's really insightful. I don't think that it is an unrealistic objective, but I do think it's important to deal with the reality of what this means in organizations. So, Paula, the same question to you: where does the idea of using collective intelligence really resonate with your experience, or where does it feel risky?
There's nothing finer than actually being in a room full of people where suddenly you can see their face light up because they feel valued, because their opinion really counts. And that's incredible. And I think, and also seeing leaders where there is a humbleness to their approach. Because what we have to do is I think for leaders, my advice to leaders, and I've said this for years across the board with this, is you don't necessarily have to come up with the answers, but know how to get the answers. And even when I go with the what and the why, sometimes, they may have, a clear understanding, or they believe is a clear understanding of the what and the why, but, open it up to be challenged. And I think the minute you create that environment is the start of continual improvement as well. It's not just one-off transformation, it's the continual, because what you're doing is creating a culture that is ready, can adapt to it, can adopt change, and support each other through it. And I think asking the question should not be dressed as a courtesy. It should be mandated that we ask people questions, that they can ask questions back, because it ultimately shapes the way that we deliver as well, rather than it being done to them. And going back onto sustainability, we're actually doing it with them, and there's more of an appreciation of doing that. And I'll just give you an example. I went to a school council. I do some voluntary work in schools, and I went to a school council, and they said a charity had come in and said, right, we're going to be your named charity, left the children to do the work, and then came back for the check and then left. And the children actually said, we did all this hard work and all they did was come in for the check and then left, and we don't know where the money's gone. What finer part is to get everybody involved that's ultimately driving for the same objective to work together, and
Wow.
it's more efficient, it's more effective, and it's more sustainable.
Absolutely agree with you, Paula. So before we go to the practical takeaways, I just wanted to give the audience a chance to ask any questions or share anything that has come up for them during this discussion. I'm a bit tempted to pick on someone I know who has lots of relevant experience. I'm kind of looking at you, Kate. Is that unfair? Um, it would be great if you, yeah, shared your thoughts with us or your experience briefly.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and I think hearing the commonality of experience across organizations, it's both reassuring and also faintly depressing as well. But hearing about the positivity where change has been couched in meaningful change, buy-in by teams and stakeholders. What we're talking about when it comes to decarbonisation and net zero, this isn't a freakish anomaly. The things that work across other areas of business we know work here. Incentives on a personal and corporate level, they work exactly the same. And I think it's also important as well for us to put ourselves in the mindset of individuals, but also other organizations who may be resistant. It's not necessarily irrational if they are hesitant, if they are cautious, and we will always do better by trying to genuinely understand what competing drivers there are affecting them, their objectives, their goals, personal and professional. So yeah, really interested hearing from different backgrounds about experiences across organizations.
Thank you, Kate. That was really, really helpful. I know you have lots of experience in this space as well, so I appreciate you sharing your perception of today. In our last few minutes, I'm going to ask both of you to share some practical takeaways because sometimes I think it sounds so obvious. One of the things that I like to do is whenever I go into a meeting with a new company, is just to observe the dynamics because I think in a meeting, that is one of the best ways that you understand how culture works, who speaks, who's encouraged to speak, who speaks, and then doesn't get listened to. And that's one of the what sounds like one of the simplest ways, but I find is not that often done. You can easily start to change something small in intervening in the dynamics of a meeting. So Paula and Abby, what tips would you give anyone on the call today that they could implement on Monday who wants to enact change?
Well, I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on what you've just said. I think it's right. Is name the gap in the room is my title for my tip. Is for all of you to take away in your next meeting. Ask directly who else's input do we need before we follow up with this, and treat silence as an answer that needs following up, and don't see it as a green light.
Wow, I love that. That's great. Abby?
Thank you. So there's a couple of things. So an extension of that, like I think it's a very odd dynamic when we join Teams calls and there will be an abundance of people. And so, a couple of dozen on a call, and actually only one or two are actually speaking.
Mhm.
Because that isn't unlocking that collective intelligence, because they're just being treated as very passive recipients, not actually asking their true opinion. And sometimes in those spaces, in large spaces or hierarchical spaces, it's really difficult to actually get that honesty through from people. But that's something which should be a red flag and should be spent some time, even if it's through one-to-ones, any leader to just ask the questions and to see that isn't a sign of agreement. I think it's a sign of quiet quitting, in a way, of just being resigned to something sometimes, especially when you're going through that creative brainstorming space. If you're not really tapping into that, I think that's nervousness. That's something to be, treated respectfully and given a bit of TLC on. And I think the other piece is around actually what does leadership look like. So it's really easy to manage people because you just tell them what to do and they do it. But actually, leading is giving space and coaching people to come up with those ideas and suggestions themselves, and even letting them do something quite different from what you yourself might do. But noting that if they have the shared objective and it works out, then hasn't that been a real success? And that really comes back to what type of leader is really needed in this space. And I think it's less authoritarian and more humble servant type leadership. In fact, the best ones I ever came across were those who really helped create the space, and they were not the biggest brains in the room, and they did not put their ego first. And I think that is really important because, coming back to, this whole point, right? This is so important collectively for all of us to actually achieve. This isn't just about those who would be the minority. This is actually, it does have that really important imperative for all of us. So I think that's the bit of leadership that we all need to be thinking about, and how do we create space that people speak up and also can come forward with ideas and suggestions and give them all the support that they need. And if it doesn't work, realize that that's a lesson, that's not a failing.
I couldn't agree more with that. And I think one of the things that I've seen again and again and again are organizations where people say, but we're doing this, we have our stakeholder reports, we have our consultants, we listen to everybody. But what actually is happening is that one group are talking and the other group are not listening. And that's often in some of the organizations where I've had the most success in helping them to unlock that, is that management are hearing complaints and other people are here not feeling heard. And as soon as you facilitate that conversation and things can be addressed, things can change. And that happens in all kinds of communication, doesn't it? And just back to your point about, I think maybe Kate's point about this is imperative to all of us. I don't think anybody could say that sustainability is not a vital issue that affects every one of us. And the two of you, Abby and Paula, know today we were talking about how hot it was and where we had to situate ourselves in our houses. This is a real issue, and we're just at the start of this right now. So I don't think anyone would disagree. So to close, I just want to come back to the tension that we started with, which was this ideal of unlocking collective intelligence and the reality of the business environment. And I just wanted to share that at Vzir, we see this again and again, even at small deliberate changes in how leaders listen and structure conversations and involve others can unlock this kind of intelligence and lead to real transformation. So I just want to thank both Abby and Paula, along with Net Zero Week and Kelly for all her help with organisation. And if you'd like to explore how we can help you apply this to your organisation, then please feel free to reach out to us to speak further. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.